Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Stefan, for the invitation today. I'd like to do a tour through a number of different topics. I've been asked to cover a wider range than normal, given the diversity of the audience and the range of your interests. So I hope to cover those in a short time and to enter a vigorous question and answer, which is more fun for me and perhaps for you. So as John mentioned, I chair an interaction design program in Detroit at the College for Creative Studies. The program's been around about 3 years, and I've designed the curriculum around my views of interaction design. But fortunately, there are these other programs nearby in the graduate studies area at the College for Creative Studies. And of course, transportation design is very prominent in Detroit, naturally. And I'll focus on that in particular, because I know it's an interest of yours as well. So the title of my talk is this, covering the areas that John and Stefan have asked me to cover. But I want to start with this word, because it's a wonderful word. People often ask me what interaction design is, but they seldom ask me what design is, which is curious in itself, perhaps. So my favorite definition of design begins with these words. Everyone designs. Well, what are the conditions of that? Everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing conditions into preferred ones. Has anyone seen this definition before? Does anyone recognize it? It's from a man by the name of Herbert Simon, who was early in AI, as it turns out, but also very influential in the field of human-computer interaction design. My journey in the middle, I'm starting in the middle, is in teaching HCI, Human-Computer Interaction Design. This was a program at Stanford that I taught in for a number of years with my colleague Hugh Dubberly, who is a design planner and teacher. And having dived into teaching systems and design with him for a number of years, I then brought this to New York City, where I also taught in an interaction design program there. And now I'm teaching and directing the program, chairing the program in the MFA area in Detroit. Some of it's conventional, some of it is screens, some of it is physical computing, building models of things that are real-world systems, real-world pieces of architecture that communicate. And I have a number of points of view on this. One is that people often say, oh, Paul, your program is the digital program. And I say, no, it's the human program. It's the program about people. And it's the program starting from the idea that interactions are fundamental and that conversation is perhaps the most important interaction that a human being can have. Even when I'm working on my device and I'm not saying anything, I'm often having a conversation in my mind about possibilities, about preferences, and making choices based on that conversation in my mind. So starting from frameworks is extremely important, and this is a seminal course that I've taught for a number of years in a number of places. Interaction design has a history, we were just talking over lunch, that this history is often lost, and it's another important part of what I teach and what I brought to the college. It's important to remember that we are building on top of decades and decades of ideas, not all of which have become pieces of software or interactions that we can have today. Many of you may have heard of Alan Kay, a seminal worker from the 60s and 70s, still around today. He kindly came by a video and gave a 2.5-hour lecture to a course on the evolution of interaction design. So my foundational ideas come from having been working in startups and coming out of computer science and humanities, and John said, and then moving into the consulting world. Now, as a consultant, I had a variety of clients over time. This was a project done in New York City for Citigroup. And this is actually quite old now. This is, I think, something like 10 years old. And the idea was that we are going to have a networked car in the future. We have a networked car today. We almost had one then, but not quite. And that there would be a future vision of this networked car. And we would be using it as a touch point for a bank as important as a branch, as important as an ATM. Now, of course, this was a little bit ahead of autonomous vehicles being clearly on the horizon. We kind of thought about it, but we didn't have any at the time. And so the idea that the interior of a car was going to be a place where people would live their lives was a somewhat novel idea. And if consumers are in their cars, then they can use them as platforms for being alive, for doing what it is that they wanted to do on a daily basis. You don't want to distract people when they're in a car, but being in a car is different than being in other spaces. So this was, in some ways, an experiment, a thought problem, to imagine someone in a car in these different boundaries and having all of these different things going on in a car. Now, these are no longer literally the best examples because the world has changed. But it's an example of doing a research project based on a thought experiment which leads you to new ways of thinking about the environments that we live in every day. And it was rather prescient, I might say. The experience became increasingly disjointed even in that time period. And one can even predict today that it's a mess. Anyone who has a screen in a car, everyone have a screen in their car? Practically everyone, right? What a mess. And then you plug in your phone and it's even worse. So it's a horribly disjointed problem, which is by no means solved. And it's partly a matter of the many different organizations that are involved across making the thing that's in the car. But it's also a matter of imagining the best way of structuring the problem. So we structured the problem from the point of view of the person being in the middle and imagining a unified interface where all of these different needs, substantially focused on home and banking, it was for a banking customer after all, and to imagine what they were already doing and putting these into classifications and then imagining these unified channels rather than 24 things going on, 3 or 4 things going on. It's just a way of structuring the problem. A little bit of bounce, I'm sorry. And now you have to sit through it again. So I've lived in this world between academia and consulting work and theoretical work that I'll get to a little bit later. This is the work of a student who graduated a couple of years ago from the MFA program at the College for Creative Studies. He's from Tehran, and practically every morning when he woke up, his car was parked in, and he had no way of talking to whoever owned the car who parked him in. And he imagined a conversation that could be held between the owners of cars, mediated with security and a lot of other things. And he looked at research. He decided on different ways of thinking about it. This bio-cost timeline is interesting. It's one of the things that I teach. We always talk about the monetary cost of things, but we don't talk about the biological cost of things. How long does something take? It's time. What's the cognitive load in understanding what's going on and in acting effectively? And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, what's the stress? Because the more stressed you are, the harder it is to do something cognitively, and the longer it takes. And the longer it takes, the more stressed you are. So these are positive feedback loops that are kind of nasty. So a journey map is something that I'm sure the designers in the audience are familiar with. This is a journey map of the biological cost of going through a day in which your car is consistently parked in. And he designed screens and did various other things. Another example of some student work was a sponsored course, as we call it, where a sponsor comes along, in this case Continental, representing Subaru, and says to the class essentially, we have this problem that we would like you to work on. And the students then proceed in the course of their 15 weeks to work on it. Now what was fun here is that we took interaction design students and we took transportation design students and we put them together. This is the way of the future. So when Ford comes through now, they say, that's what we're trying to do, can you help us? And we say, of course we can help. We can't solve the problem, but we can help you think about it as best we can. So very quickly, I'm going to go through these examples as well. So we start from personas, which is a standard practice in design today that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Who is this person? What is their name? What do they do? What do they see? How do they see the world? How do they spend their time? And then we imagined that in an autonomous car, since they have nothing to do for 2 hours or 3 hours, or as I just spent an hour and 15 minutes coming down from San Francisco, it was autonomous, somebody else was driving for me, so that kind of worked out. These are the various modes that you might imagine them being in. So how do you modify the interior of the car to accommodate what the passenger wants to do? Well, you could have sensors, you can imagine, 5, 10, 20 years from now. And these sensors could take body data non-invasively and could actually change the interior of the car based on what the system thinks the goal of the user is. And this could be by taking data from all different kinds of brainwaves, which imply different things. Is the person resting, active, meditating, and so on. And these are the things that you could control in the interior of the car automatically. But of course, you don't want it always to do what it wants to do. You need an override mode to say, no, 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 I put the window down, or it's too warm for me, or your guess about what I want isn't quite correct, so please do something different. So one idea was the car could see where the passenger is looking, and then the passenger could use a gesture to change one of the settings in the car, for example. The first drive, of course, would have to be based on some kind of averaging of big data, because the car wouldn't know you yet. But over time, and over behavior witnessing and taking Oliver's data, so to speak, on the 100th drive, it would be much better at anticipating what the individual user's needs are. So this is part of the story. An examination that involves sketching, a sketch for each mode, an imagination of how reading body data would change the interior configuration. Maybe physically, but certainly in terms of air and light. Again, the idea here is not to get stuck on it, but rather to show the range and quality of the sketching of the students. Another journey map. This is just a second example, two different personas, a set of needs, a journey map of their day, focusing on a particular aspect of the journey. This is an adventurer who likes to take his car into the wild and might have a backpack which would have extraordinary and magical powers, not really. But one of the things it could do is the car could follow this person as he travails the mountain and be where he comes out. Another experiment in gestures, you could put up your hand, it could see your hand, and by doing gestures on the hand, you could control what the interior of the car is doing. Just thought experiments, ideation, and so on. Of course, getting to the home screen is something you still have to do. And finally, some quick examples of some very beautiful rendering work, which is typical of the students that we have at CCS in transportation design. So I want to come back. I've been asked to talk a little bit about how somebody who started in computer science and also humanities, again, as John said, ended up interested in design and the kind of design that I like to do. There was a group at MIT called the Architecture Machine Group. It's not as well known as the Media Lab. It came before the Media Lab. And it was started by the same man, Nicholas Negroponte. And when I got there in '67 and joined the team, it was a small team, one of the projects was something called graphical conversation theory. I'll get to conversation theory in a minute. But the idea was that you could graphically interact with someone on the other side of the interface. Excuse me, I misspoke. You could graphically interact with a machine, is what I meant to say. Now, what would that mean and how would that work? Well, first, this little icon graphic here is interesting in its own way. So this is a person talking to a machine. And this is a person talking through a machine and then through a network to another machine to another person. And then do you care to guess what this case means? Yes. So it's essentially a machine-human conversation. Conversation, not interaction, not the person pokes and the machine does its zeros in one thing and responds, but rather has a conversation with the human. This was the goal at that time, to look at that problem. And it wasn't so far out because Nicholas Negroponte had written a couple of books, one called The Architecture Machine, which I recommend to you. It's extraordinary work and very prescient, and still not achieved in the modern age. But inside of his Soft Architecture Machine book, the follow-on to it, was an article by Gordon Pask, who was a consultant to the Architecture Machine. And when I met Pask, it was a change in thinking and a change in my direction. The paper that he wrote was based largely on diagrams like this. And here's a zoom in on one. This is the diagram of a conversation. I know you may not believe me. But this is a theory. This is not a hodgepodge. This is not Society of Mind. Anyone familiar with Society of Mind by Marvin Minsky? A few people. That's a bunch of interesting ideas, page after page. This is a unified theory. It's a very different idea. So here we have on the left side a participant, and on the right side a participant in a conversation. And there are many details here that don't really matter. This is in Pask's own hands. But one of the distinctions that he made that was really quite important is that in conversation there are different levels implied. Some of the exchanges are about what we're doing, and some of the exchanges are about why we're doing it. Action versus intent. And this distinction is lost in Siri and conversational interfaces and many, many other things. I suggest that as you leave here today and as you go through your day, you might imagine, wait a minute, that was an exchange about what I want as opposed to an exchange about why I want it. Intent and action are intermixed in conversation every day, but when you make the distinction, then you can interact with machines in a different way. Now, technically, these are just nested feedback loops, and I don't have time to go into that. But there's a formalism here that one can study and take advantage of. And it's a formalism that I often teach to students because it helps them understand the natures of interactions in conversation. But Pask's idea, and Nicholas's pickup of that idea, was that you could have a designer on one side of a conversation and an architecture machine on the other side of the conversation to talk about design. Not to have the machine do the calculation, you need a beam this large, here's how the CAD drawing would look, but a conversation about the goals, the intentions, the purpose of the design activity. This was revolutionary at the time, 40 years ago. Still not achieved, largely left behind, except by a few of us. So Pask formalism is there. I invite you to examine it. Engineers have no problem with it. It's essentially examining what happens in a conversational frame when participants interact with a series of components in the conversation very quickly. There's a context in which the conversation begins. There's a language which is sufficiently shared to get it going. There's an engagement back and forth. There are agreements that are tacit and sometimes explicit. And then there might be actions or transactions. Looks simple, common sense, you get it. I don't know of any voice interfaces or conversational interfaces that do this. And until they do, they're going to be really annoying, as they are today. So this is a design pattern. This would be a way of designing voice interfaces to be closer to conversation. It's going from a theory or a formalism or a concept into the technology rather than playing Tinker Toys and hoping to move. Or as we said in a brief lunch we had earlier, it's like climbing a tree and expecting after a while to get to the moon. This is the metaphor of AI currently today that Mo mentioned. So what are examples of conversational machines? Has it ever been done? Isn't it impossible? Well, there are many examples I could give you from Pask's work himself. He built these two machines on the left and the right. One taught the other essentially a differential equation. So he was into machines talking to machines a long time ago. There was an exhibit in 1968, 50 years ago, called Cybernetic Serendipity, and Pask's field was indeed cybernetics, the discipline, not the hype of cyborgs and AI and implant and so on, but the discipline of cybernetics, which is essentially the discipline of systems that have purpose. So cybernetics comes from a word meaning to steer or to pilot artfully, to have a goal, to act to get toward the goal, to be blown off course, to see the difference between what you want and what you have. That's called feedback. Feedback entered the vocabulary in the 1940s as a consequence of this discipline, cybernetics, being prominent. If you go to the Google Ngram viewer, you're familiar with the Ngram viewer? It essentially counts the number of words that are in books over time. And feedback does this, does this, does this, and then in the 1940s it does that because of cybernetics. It entered the zeitgeist in many ways. Anyway, this exhibition in London at the Institute for Contemporary Arts 50 years ago was vast. It had 130 pieces in it, and it had Gordon's Colloquy of Mobiles in it. So Gordon Pask, scientist, theoretician, cybernetician, had this idea that you could have these mobiles, male and female figures. This is a female figure here and a male figure, a little difficult to see in this picture. Sorry. Here we go. It's difficult to see in the picture, I'm sorry. So the female and the male mobiles rotate, and they make noises, and they have lights on them. And when a particular coincidence of a light from one bounces off the other and bounces back, then they stop and they interact. And then after a while, they go back to doing what they were doing. But of course, someone walking through the gallery can come with a flashlight and can fool these things and can interact with them and can interrupt their conversation. This was a sensation. This is often quoted in articles even to this day about it being the first of its kind, et cetera. And a great example of having machines talking to machines in which human beings can also intercede. I have a project now to reproduce this at full scale, 12 feet by 12 feet, something like that, at the College for Creative Studies. We're in the middle of fabricating it. We've been asked to take it on tour and all kinds of other things. What the students, of course, learn by doing the archaeology is what was done then and what were the assumptions then and so on, and a number of other things. But what they also can do is extrapolate into today, because we're not going to use the same computers. That would be silly. But by using Arduino and digital technology and simple software, they will be able to use cloud computing and Alexa voice and a variety of things to imagine what it would be like to have machines talking to machines today. So this is one of the projects that one can do. It's part of an Internet of Things prototyping class. It's part of a programming class. It's part of an interaction design curriculum. So this is the project that we're in the middle of. Pask built a number of machines that talk to machines. I reproduced one of them in a dissertation of mine, but we don't need to spend time on this. This was a commercial product, or experiment, I should say, called Thought Shuffler. These are search keyword terms on the left. And what's happening here is the different results are prioritizing and re-ranking and literally shuffling back and forth. It was very complicated. Nobody really wanted to use it except researchers. I built a version that I showed to Condé Nast, and they were interested, but they didn't know where to put the advertisements, so it didn't go very far. It's a true story. This I'm most proud of, a little beyond what we have time for today, but this is a search engine, a reading engine interface on a mobile device. And it's a way of, instead of getting a link that gives you an entire page of results that you then have to read, it picks a paragraph. And it picks that paragraph based on a model of conversation in which it's imagining the best paragraph for you now, based on a heuristic, based on the ideas that come from conversation theory. So I'm trying to establish some bona fides, if you will, about having done some product design work and tried to bring conversational interfaces to the market. You don't have to literally have a conversation interface. This was a client that I worked with who had essentially a WebMD service. And the goal was to improve it such that people could navigate through this complex of information about diseases and symptoms and so on and so forth. All I did was, by talking to them, created a conversation map in which, for example, very often people come to these and they type in a symptom. They say headache. And it will say, well, you might have a migraine or you might have brain cancer. And you think, wait a minute, brain cancer. What kinds of symptoms are there in brain cancer? Well, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I don't have those symptoms. OK. So essentially, you're in a conversation in this loop. Or you're in a conversation in any of these various loops throughout the entire process of going from having a symptom, getting tested, being diagnosed, having treatment, and then the outcomes. So even thinking about conversation as happening at the interface can lead to interesting consequences. I've been asked to talk a little bit about design. How am I doing on time? Fine, good. 10. So people talk a lot about design thinking. It's been around a very long time in the internet sense. And you can simplify design thinking into a set of processes. It's often a way of saying that design is at the beginning, design is not just at the end, design is not analytical or business thinking. There are many benefits to what's come with design thinking. The difficulty I see is that it's become a way of claiming that if you do design thinking, you can get innovation. It's as if A leads to B. And I don't think it's quite that simple. These are the components of design thinking. And there's a matter of evaluating and testing along the way and iterating. There are limitations of it. For example, it doesn't really talk about specifics or what's rigorous or what's feasible. And measuring improvements and measuring convergence isn't always explicit. I think of these steps, observe, brainstorm, and prototype, as essentially a conversation to agree on means. We have a design, we're going to get what we want by doing those steps, and that's a way of agreeing on means. But there are some problems with this. It's not clear how to measure these things on the left. And where are the design goals in the conversation? I didn't hear much about that when I talked about observing and brainstorming and prototyping. So this is my revision proposal. We'll start with this conversation to agree on means, and then we'll have an explicit conversation to agree on goals. Hello. This is the same as the stratification in the Gordon-Task model, where some of the times we're talking about what we're doing, and some of the time we're talking about why we're doing it. It's about intention and action. Now, you have to evaluate whether or not this conversation about what we're building will actually achieve the goal of why we're building it. This has to be explicit. And similarly, we have to ask the question, who's in the conversation? Do we have the right people in the conversation? Maybe, maybe not. But we certainly have to design the designing. I'm going very fast here, I apologize. But I don't think you'll disagree that design is a conversation. Even if I'm designing something in my head, I'm having a conversation about the pros and cons, the constraints, and so on. If I'm in a team, it better be conversation. Otherwise, one person rules because of their role or because they're louder. But it's all about justification and so on. So this is a proposal to ask questions about the kinds of conversations we need to do design. Now, it's a little unfair just for me to show you some blue boxes. So I want to spend just a minute on what it means to design for conversations. Usually, we have people in a conversation. These are people. Dot, dot, dot. You get the iconography. And we have this conversation. And we want to make sure we have the right people in the conversation. So how do we design for variety? Well, a conversation builds new knowledge, and we could ask ourselves the question, what did we learn? And not only did we learn something, but we have new questions that that new knowledge led us to. And now there's a next conversation that we want to have. And usually what happens is we get 10 people, we put them on a team, we meet every Monday at 10 o'clock for 3 hours, week after week after week, and it's the same people, and we just keep going. But we don't usually think about it this way. If we thought about it in this way, what's the advantage? Well, we can say to ourselves, who do we need in the next conversation? I don't want to be in that meeting every week unless you need me. And worse is, what is the expertise that's missing? So shouldn't there be a selection mechanism to decide who comes next week? Not because we want to be exclusive or eliminate people, but because we want to be both efficient. You don't have to be there, I don't have to be there, thank you, I need the time to do other work. But we also want to be effective. Who do we need in the conversation, and what external information do we need to add to the conversation? So this is just a way of designing conversation. You want to select for the people that you think you need next time. There are no guarantees. But this pattern becomes something that becomes a cadence. Because at least in the advertising field, which was the client that I did this for, the client calls, which is the catalyst. You have ideation, you generate a solution, you deliver it, and you evaluate it. There's some iteration in here as well, of course. But you notice the pattern repeats, where we never assume that we have the right people in the room. We always ask, this is what we did, what are we going to do next, and how do we get it? So designing for conversation is a way of being explicit about the process. So that's the idea of that box. Well, as you might imagine, there's a spot missing. And this is into that hairy, terrible thing called innovation. How do we make sure that we get innovation? This is a brief excursion. This is a work I did with some extraordinary colleagues. The catalyst was a client from DuPont who realized that DuPont had done this. And I was at Sun Microsystems, and we were having a conversation, and we noticed that Sun was doing this. And we asked ourselves the question, why did that happen? And here's our answer. So that famous book, Innovator's Dilemma, that's a description of what happens. We are here attempting an explanation of what happens. An organization is its language. It's how it sees the world. This is not English versus German. This is the distinctions, the values, the relationships that it sees and uses to define itself. Now, here's the bad news. The better an organization gets at doing what it's doing, the more it narrows its language. And narrowing language also increases ignorance, because the past language limits the future vision. So when a company starts going down, it's not because they understand the world and decide not to go with it changing. It's because they can't see the changes in the world. They don't have the distinctions for it. It's like Microsoft not having the distinctions and the values that mean the internet and the browser. That took a while for them to get there. Only one example of many, many, many that I could afford. So your only choice, if you're a big company and you need to innovate, in the true sense of the word, not do better at what you're already doing, but change what you're doing and do better. The only thing you can do is to expand language in order to increase opportunity. And therefore, that's the way of innovating. So this is a different offer than design thinking. Design thinking says you do these things, you mix them up, you get innovation. No, seriously, they do claim that. There are papers that claim that. But that's not a methodology, and I don't find it tight enough. So I'm trying to go a little further with it and to add to it and to refine and to hopefully offer some ways of doing what it wants to do, which is to innovate. So this missing box becomes a conversation to create new language. So I'm almost done. I was asked to talk a little bit about implications and ethics. And in general, what you hear me saying is that the goal of design is to create conversations for action, not to create conversations for thinking, but to get things done. And I've created a bit of a syllogism here. If we converse explicitly about goals, then we're transparent about what we're trying to do. And if we talk about the means, then we're engaging participants and we're being collaborative. Furthermore, if we co-evolve new language, then we can escape the current limitations. And if we converse about the design process in general and enter all conversations in an equitable way, then we can be responsible. This is really another way of saying what I've said already, which is this. Now I have a brief parable and then some proposals. I have a few more minutes? How am I doing? So this is the parable of Luigi's Pizza. Will someone play with me? Would someone like to play? I need someone to ask me, where is there good pizza? Ask me, where's there good pizza? Right across the street at Luigi's Pizza. It's amazing pizza. Now ask me, why is it good pizza?
And why is that?
Screw you, I'm not going to tell you why. I just described Google. Right? Get it? Now we know why. But I claim that this is unethical. I claim that conversation is the minimal ethical interface where reliable transparency about action and intent is necessary. One can talk about this for a long time, but I'm trying to be brief now. It's back to this. It's back to having these things in the minds and the conceptual models of the individuals somehow available and compatible. Now, conversation matters because to act together we have to reach agreement, have an exchange, and we do that in a shared language. So cooperation and collaboration requires conversation. Many things follow from conversation. Without conversation, I claim you can't do these things. Now, I'm not suggesting that Google, when you say, why is Luigi's Pizza the best pizza, give me 25 pages of terms and conditions or privacy policy or that kind of thing. So my second corollary is, or axiom, if you will, is that the minimal humane interface is one where you can have a conversation about it. In the same way that you could ask me why I like Luigi's, I would say, well, for you, it has gluten-free and they're sustainable and they pay their people well and it's convenient, or whatever it may be. So there are aspects of good conversations. I think you can build a machine that can have this kind of conversation, but you have to want it. But the general idea about design, and then I really am done, is this idea of second-order design, designing for conversation. We really want other people to design their own lives. As designers, we don't want to force people to do certain things. But that means that we want to create conditions for conversation emerging in which we're increasing the number of choices. This is the fundamental ethical thing I can do as one human being to another, is to allow you to have more choice than you have now. And this, for me, is the goal of design. Thank you for your patience.
Questions, and I'll bring the mic around too if you have any.
Thank you for great presentation. I understand what your opinion of Google is as a platform. When we design a platform in technology like that, Facebook comes into mind, right? Obviously, Facebook is designed for intense interaction. What's your thought about Facebook as a platform or technology as a platform to encourage interaction, which should be in the direction that you're encouraging it?
I feel similarly about Facebook as I do about Google because, as Tristan Harris is now writing very eloquently, it's designed to grab your attention more than it's designed to help you do what you want to do or to be who you want to become. It's the filter bubble, it's all of those issues. Platforms are inevitable. They bring economy of scale, they bring network effects so that you can reach a lot of people and all of that. But I fear that they've lost the responsibility that they have to offer something that is both ethical and humane. And this is why I'm trying to argue from these axiomatic points of view. What's the baseline? In almost a moral sense or an ethical sense. And can we ask them to proceed from that and to be more transparent about what they're doing in order to benefit us rather than purely benefit the machine of the quarterly report? So I don't have a better answer than that, but I feel very similarly about both of those.
In other words, you would like to put more human in the HLI, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And to really enable conversation. It's not a conversational interface in that sense. I can't interrogate it in the best sense. I can't ask it individualized questions that efficiently come back to me with what I want. Thank you.
Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
The materiality of conversation to design, it reminds me of a quote from a guy that you're probably very familiar with, Norbert Wiener.
Of course.
He believed in materiality of messaging and messages in basically
Yes.
any interface.
Yes.
Man to machine, machine to machine, or man to man.
Yeah.
We've accomplished quite a bit on that front in machine to machine. Are you aware of anybody who's taken that kind of engineering approach to interaction, in particular interaction design, for messaging to become the material and quantum part of it?
I don't. It's a wonderful question. We do implicitly in many ways. I mean, Wiener, who wrote a book called Cybernetics, which was part of the founding of the field. The other founding of the field were all of the other scientists and sociologists and anthropologists and this wide range of people who came together in a series of meetings called the Macy meetings, which are equally important. They were asking the question in general, what does it mean to have systems that have purpose, that want to steer? And how do they get what they want, and so forth. So that's the founding of the field. The beauty of Wiener, though, and of cybernetics in general, is it made the shift from the questions being about stuff to the questions being about information. So the purely immaterial components of systems. That's the reason why cybernetics talk about feedback, because it's the information that comes back. It's not about the information being the thermodynamics of the molecules of the air telling the thermostat that it should turn on the heat. It was a shift to information as materiality. That's a very beautiful way of bringing up the topic. We're living in that age, even though we don't understand it as such. And I think we're a bit irresponsible, per the other question, about keeping the humane and ethical quality of it. Thank you.
Any more questions? Question to John? No?
I was going to ask not to get too topically specific, but about automotive. Because from our standpoint, we are largely a memory and processor company that sold to a lot of laptops and data centers, and relatively suddenly we've decided to go all in on the automotive space. So it's relatively new for us, and we're still exploring what does it really mean to be in automotive. And from a design standpoint, way beyond that diagram you had, it's an interesting new frontier of what these sort of mobility blobs, whatever they are, will look like. And I'm just curious what your view is of the forthcoming automotive space as a playground for doing this kind of interaction design.
Well, I think it's the space, because as I described from the student work, it's an environment in which people can act to get what they want within the strengths and weaknesses of this capsule that is moving them from one place to another. Per the city work, the car is different than other environments. And it's especially different when I don't have to worry about steering it. Also, this example of bringing the interaction designers and the transportation designers together, this is phenomenal. It's difficult. The language of car design is very different than the language of interaction design. But that's where the future lies in this, this combination, this synthesis. And we're only at the very, very beginning of that. People will be spending a lot of time in vehicles that move, and much less time worrying about moving them, directing them, steering them, right? So oddly enough, we're moving away from people steering to now having people in vehicles with this open-ended question of what might they do and how might they do it. That's why it seems a little far out to be reading brainwaves and saying, this person is meditating, therefore I should lower the blinds and turn down the music. But that's what a thermostat is in this room, right? It's trying to keep us comfortable. It's trying to regulate an environment for our benefit. The beauty of that is it forces us back to say, what do we want? How do we know that that's the right thing that a person wants? And then how do we create environments which lowers the biological cost, the bio cost of worrying about making it comfortable or worrying about configuring in a way that makes sense. So the strongest answer to your question, John, is this is one of the most important environments we have, because it's an unsolved question. When you have an environment that you can manipulate with all of this data about the physiology and the goal and activities inside this space that is both highly constrained and also a big opportunity, this is the vanguard of where I think interaction design is. Please.
Yeah, hi. So what I see that you're building is a formalized structure for having very effective conversations, essentially conversations where clearly understood what the intent is, clearly understood what the outcome needs to be, and
as clearly as possible.
As clearly as possible, exactly. And then I think of a scenario where conversations like that have to happen, which is in, say, a new product development scenario.
Yes.
Everyone's coming in with slightly different interpretations of what that new product can be. Can you use this structure to sort of identify misunderstandings, gaps, and maybe talk us through how that would work?
Sure. So this is an idealized view, and this figure eight diagram is, beautiful and happy and imagines, as you're suggesting, that it always goes well. The thing about misunderstandings is they arise in the absence of enough concrete specificity. The more we talk in the air, the more likely I am to misunderstand you. But if in the process of executing these 4 boxes, we're not just saying, well, our goal is, but I would ask you, well, how are you going to achieve your goal? And could you prototype that? Oh, here's a Post-it note. Let's go and do a sketch. Then making concrete and making manifest the ideas are the ways of me saying better what I meant and you better being able to say, no, no, wait a minute, I don't understand, that doesn't make sense. So you said this is what you want, but you're doing, sorry, you said this is what you want, but you're doing that, it doesn't make sense to me. So the explicitness of the methodology is in part an attempt to require concreteness in all 4 areas, such that misunderstandings will better emerge. So I don't know that I need something within it that is about the exposing of misunderstandings aside from this desire to be concrete in these specific ways. It's a very abstract answer to a very concrete problem. I'm sorry.
One more quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Last topic that you brought.
Wait a minute, otherwise people can't hear you.
I see. Is it nasty? It has a white dot on the back. That's a little scary.
You mentioned about the rise and fall of companies and
Yeah.
businesses, and basically the process of a business starting with a broader scope of doing things in the business, which you called it basically the language or the breadth of the language.
Mm.
And as they get good at one thing, it narrows and narrows, and eventually the world moves on to different things, which the company is not prepared for.
Yes.
How do you prevent that?
You can't prevent a company from wanting to make more profit in what they're doing now, because that would be anti-capitalistic, and the shareholders wouldn't want it, and management would not be rewarded. And you don't want to stop that, because what you're making now is something you want to continue making smaller, cheaper, faster, right? You want to get more profit out of the thing you're doing. That's the narrowing part. So what you have to do, and it's suggested a little bit here, but this document and another document goes into more detail, is you have to create other processes which are separated from the daily business. And those processes are where new language is being incubated. And you have to have many trials, and you have to continue to feed the ones that are going well and let go of the ones that are not. I mean, one could keep going with that. I'm very often asked to give an innovation talk. Paul, you know, we really need to do some innovation here. These people are working hard. You know, they're working 40 hours or 50 hours a week on the day-to-day business, and they have to make profit, and they have to be more efficient. But they need to be stoked up about also innovating, about also spending time inventing new ideas. Can you come and do that? No. No, I can't, because it's impossible. Even if they had the time, the obsession with the day-to-day is a completely different way of thinking and a completely different set of skills and activities from imagining something that is not here now and inventing the future in the form of creating new language, to think in new ways, to see the world in new ways, such that you can have new things happen. They're fundamentally contradictory activities, and it's impossible to do them both together, I'm sorry. And there are many examples. Skunk Works, right? Gore-Tex leaves DuPont because he can't do it inside of DuPont. He goes somewhere else and invents this new kind of fabric, and on and on and on and on. There are so many examples of companies doing this, and so few of them transforming and creating new language. There are some. IBM said in the 90s, hey, we're not a hardware company, we're a services company. Well, how did that get achieved? By killing the court, in the phrase of my colleague, firing thousands of managers who had the old language, who didn't want to think in this new way. It's get on the bus or get off of the bus. Anyway, one could go on and on. There's some examples about that. How are we doing? Is this on?
We are done. I think folks have to get on.
I'm sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.